Hey, good morning. This morning we get to talk to Denise Prince about her current exhibition, Lacquer Panique, on view at the gallery Ivester Contemporary. Just opened Saturday night. And we can start, like we start all these Instagram lives, maybe you can introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about the title.
Sure. My name is Denise Prince, as Kevin said. I'm an artist from Texas. I went to college mostly at CalArts near Los Angeles, which was pretty theoretical. So painters somewhat stopped painting, and I had been a painter, but stopped. Not mostly just because I was really interested in the theoretical discussions that were available there, and starting to understand meaning. It was just central to the way my mind worked, so it was a perfect fit for me. But that's the very quickest background.
Yeah, your start. And then you moved into photography and film and performance for years.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I made a feature film with a woman I did a lot of performance work with at college, and it took us about 10 years because it was on film. We financed it ourselves. One of those low budget films back when independent film was really happening in America and elsewhere, but especially here, there was a big wave of it. And we actually did quite well with it. But after, I think, starting to raise money for another film was just way too intimidating for me. So photography became a way in which I could do elaborate setups and whatnot, but fully at my own. There was nothing that could stop me. And film, we had been somewhat brave at just going forward. But it just worked for me, and I loved it. So I concentrated on photography. It seems like almost 20 years. Until I got back into painting.
And that's where we are now.
Yeah, exactly. A full show of paintings.
Yeah, so, I mean, it looks like about 13, 12 paintings here. And some of them are quite large, like the ones behind us. And how about the title of the show, Lacquer Panique, before we get too far? What does that title mean to you, and what made you land on that?
Well, it really, lacquer was mostly a word of pulling out of a thesaurus because I was looking for things that were evoking surface, gloss, and I liked the way that lacquer, I'm not sure why I'm pronouncing it lacquer, but I am, made me think of
word to play.
Product sort of in my, not that I'd thought of that at all in my mind, but and panique, I'm saying again, panique, because it seems like it would be pronounced that way. Because it felt like a European ad to me. Like the panique is this sort of excitement of. It was a very light way to talk about anxiety of some sort. Not that anxiety is really behind a lot of the work in the show, but but for the ways that the sort of sense of disturbance, I think, is reflected in our time and in the work, I wanted to reference that. So it worked really well. The kind of combination of the two, trying to be playful.
Yeah, this sort of polished panic.
Yes.
And that's how the exhibition really reads. And I agree with you. I think panic is maybe is too, because a lot of this work feels very hopeful and uplifting. And but there's a chaos and a disorganization to your paintings that are beautiful and exciting first, but there is that unease, I think, in some of the work. So was that all purposeful?
I think all of my work, or a lot of my work, either masks or points to existential dread and anxieties. Not because, and that's just because I've been in psychoanalysis for up to 17 years, and so doing so much work in that area of dealing with what it means to be to exist is just always, it's just so, I'm just facile in that sort of thinking. And so it's something that I feel is behind a lot of the work behind my instinct to make art.
Yeah.
In some ways, even though this work I think is much more is less involved there, but I do feel that trails with me on my dress as everywhere I go.
What I like about your interest in what it means to exist, there's a twist on that, because you're not only interested in what it means to exist, but you're also interested in what it means to perform as we are, and our sort of role in this play of life.
Yes.
Yeah.
I'd probably call that a bit more the ways that we're making sense of who we are as we go, and it doesn't seem to stop, especially when, and, one of my favorite quotes is that fantasy organizes our experience of everyday reality and tells us who we are. And knowing what I do about the subconscious and the ways that we operate, we are operating from a position of how we've been informed, how we've been put together, how things went in. And we can almost not escape that. So it's just simply a feature of being human. But I find it fascinating. And I think that for me, I lost my train of thought.
Well, another big part of this show is your interest in advertising. And you
Yes.
talk about, performance and existing, we're constantly figuring out who we are.
Yes.
But there's also these influences being put on us.
Yes.
Sometimes in the form of advertising. It's one of the influences that does sort of mold us in a way.
I think it's very difficult not to take things in as they're given, and advertising is almost always working with this idea of an imaginary body, and that's a body that's not subject to death. And so it's very appealing, and it's a lot of what's behind a lot of comfort in the world, and a lot of desire, and a lot of what we busy ourselves with. So I think the ways in which, becoming an adult, learning how to negotiate who one is within oneself and within the world, those are equal challenges in terms of making sense of things and making sense of who one will be, and other choices, you'll make, and what you'll stand up for, and to me, the extent to which you can really look at those, and to me, just seeing them, noting that, most of my work always is pointing to the fact that it's a construction. And as much as at times I feel like I have been seeming especially to look askance at advertising, it's more just that I'm fascinated with the ways that it is a context in which fantasy is so explicit. And so going into that context, and I found a very saturated space to make adjustments and to play and to push different directions. And I think that's a lot of what I'm doing here.
How aware do you think that people are that advertising is a fantasy?
I think it's I feel like on some level we all are aware of that, but I feel that most of the way we experience life is taking things that we feel and see and think as real. And my training has been such that I have learned to sort of almost more immediately have suspicion about my own self-deception at all times. And I think that without having had my face sort of nudged towards that by my analyst, and at times being willing to run towards it and look myself, that it's very difficult to recognize. There's been, from back in I guess it was the 60s, John Berger was writing about these things. It's always been a subject of not just advertising, but just the ways in which, and semiotics, the ways in which we read and interpret meaning from the things we see. And advertising is just a very easy space to see it because it's very explicit.
Yeah.
It's very pointed.
Yeah. Yeah, one of the things that I think is fascinating about you returning to painting, and I'm curious to hear what you're interested in returning to painting, why that happened, but one of the things that strikes me and is exciting to me is that you spent so much time taking photographs, playing with film, and that's a lot, and you played more explicitly with dissecting advertising in those photographs, I think. And this is sort of like a return to analog. And here we are having this conversation on Instagram. Instagram
exactly.
Live.
Sure.
Where we're just completely flooded all the time with the way we think other people are living.
Yes.
Or, being flooded with advertising. And this is a return to analog. And I think there's something so special in being able to see the human hand. This is a new painting show for you. This is a return to painting after years. And you were really vulnerable, I think. You put yourself in this position where you had to make mistakes, fix those mistakes, learn about your painting style. What was all that like, and is that why you felt like you wanted to return to painting?
I think that was what kept me from doing it for so long. The sense that even though I have made a few paintings over the years, and I have a certain amount of blind confidence that I could take on anything.
It worked.
Thank you. And I think it actually helped to have that being on the edge of just past my own signposts of comfort, because not only the physicality of pushing paint around and deciding how I want to put it down and what is beauty in each moment, and whether how I'm not so much interfacing with beauty, but just really the paint, the medium itself was, I didn't take it as the challenge, but doing it was incredibly challenging, because to come up with a painting, the way the first one came about was such that I felt like I knew what I wanted and needed. And so I could execute that almost in the way that I did with photography, where I was almost like an advertisement. I could see the concept and I could execute it. And then there was some amount of like slow going with the paint itself that, having been a painter young and it was the first thing it was my first love. It truly struck me. And I had spent a year after high school painting and listening to records and reading books. That's just what I did. And that freedom, and the reasons I made painting then was, I think, to organize my mind, or to try to understand, to try to make sense of living a lot more than now. And I think that I felt that I am at a place in my life where I have a very solid footing that will, of course, I feel like that there's a way in which there's so many demands of the world, and that the world is so increasingly hysteric that in some ways I'm better when things are crazy, because I know how to collect myself and take a step. And even if that's intimidating, and it was intimidating, and I'm sorry, I'm bouncing around a lot here. It just felt like, why hadn't I done this? And it was worth doing. But the process of deciding how to create a beginnings of a language in paint, and then how these works would communicate with each other, and really not wanting to duplicate method or duplicate the approach, but to stick, but it's still my continued fascination with surface and how we understand who we are, as it relates to surface and advertising, and fantasy. It was just enough of a challenge that I started to find my way. And I think that if those little breadcrumbs hadn't been left throughout the years, I don't know what I'd be walking on, but I could manage it.
Yeah, I mean, the viewers can only see these two paintings behind us, but I think you have done such a great job of tying this entire exhibition together as a real complete show.
Yes.
The movement throughout the space, seeing different moments reflected in different canvases is really strong. And of course, in Denise Prince fashion, you have this awesome set design moment with this huge perfume bottle that, viewers will see later on in different posts. But I'm also curious, the difference between setting up a photograph, in the process of taking a photograph. Your photographs are not candid. You're putting a lot of thought into positioning, small symbols, big symbols, things that are fleeting, things that are incredibly intentional, everything in between. And then, snap, a photograph gets taken, and the image is executed so quickly.
Yes.
How is that different than painting?
Well, I think similarly, I don't do well in painting when I am finding my way as I go, because it's very much like an experience of love, although it's similar to the experience of looking through a camera where you see differently. I do often, if I'm looking through a camera at someone, I see them differently, because in ways I'm seeing what the camera sees, and I know that they become an object more explicitly, and I see beauty, and there's a funny thing that happens. But when creating painting, there's a similar the paint on the brush and the creation as you go can be so enticing that I can get distracted. And so if I am just making choices as I go, I don't stop enough to think, how is this going to look to someone who doesn't know what they're coming up to. Like you won't see, that process is not communicated. And because my work is so specific to what is seen is intentional, even when it's very loose and I leave room to breathe in areas, or I really needed for these to plan in advance. And there were times at which something wasn't working and I would scrape it off or sand it down, and or take a photo of where I was and then realize that where I was going I wasn't happy with it. And then I would say, what could work here? Yeah. And so I would take it back to the computer and put in other things and try it until I felt I could see the thing that would then work, which is like looking through the camera and seeing the moment. So I want to believe that I'm a person who is in the creative moment freely, but I think that I think more like an advertiser in which I'm composing, and because the intention, I just don't think it'd come together otherwise. And I have proof. I have canvases that are worth looking at.
Yeah, I mean, I think just like personally, even how you live your life, I think you do a great job of both preparing and deep thought, and then having the skill and confidence to be able to improvise as you go. I mean, it's really visible in the paintings, especially. And one thing about the techniques that you've learned through photography, and you mentioned just now bringing images of your paintings back into a computer.
Yes.
Throughout the painting process, I think is really evident, and even for the viewers to be able to see in the background some of these hard, or they're not hard edges, but they look like hard edges.
Yeah.
Like these sort of cut moments in your compositions that actually shows a look behind the curtain of your process, which is you overlaying images in Photoshop and playing with opacity. And I think it's so fascinating and such a good representation of art making right now.
Yes.
Because this process, to be able to photograph something and then bring it into Photoshop and play with that, wasn't even possible like 30 years ago.
Sure. And I don't know if I used to work from photographs, but I didn't compose, with anything besides my thoughts. And I do feel like for me, the way that I'm of my time is the ways in which, as I said, I think the world's very hysteric right now, and that people are feeling a lot of anxiety. And that's just the language of that's the language of what I've been thinking of for so many years. And so the ways in which this reflects who we are now also has a lot to do with the fact that I didn't come to these wanting hope, but I had a much greater commitment to beauty in them. And that's very complicated. But if you know my previous work, it's not that you're going to see where I've come, but I feel like I've gone very heavily into determining what is beautiful and what is beautiful for me, but also here, for once, forcing myself not to, or it's almost more of the kind of finding a way of committing to continuing the beauty to be apparent or to be forefront, and really just trying to figure out how much of the how much can I push it and yet keep the beauty, not push it too much away. Like that there's not necessarily a balance in these pieces, but amongst the show that there's a lot of intention to create a sort of my own vision of what can be beautiful while in a very different way than I've done previously.
Yeah, one thing that I love about painting is it's not rooted in reality.
Yes.
And you're giving us completely new images and you're painting in a new way. I mean, I think that your paintings really are incredibly unique, and that's hard to do today when we're just completely flooded with images of other people's paintings. And
sure.
It feels very unique to you. And I find it interesting that as a photographer, you've of course worked with representational images, real life things that you're photographing for so long. And yet, while these paintings reference real life things, they're heavily abstract.
That, and they're also heavily sort of illustration based. There's not a lot of figurative, there's nothing figurative particularly. Even the baby's quite flat, or especially flat in that painting. And I lost track of where you were
Well,
going.
just thinking about abstraction and why you wanted to dive into abstraction and how that came about. I mean, was it a conscious thing to start? I'm going to work in an abstract mode, or because like in this painting on the right, there's some representational
Yes.
details.
Yes.
The sleeve of a garment. What was it like deciding, okay, I'm going to, in this painting that the viewers can't see, there's a really representational perfume bottle, and then there's
Yes.
hints of a banquet happening, but only upon really close looking do you see those things.
Yes. I think that it's difficult to sort of comprehend because there's a lot of variety, but I think because I was working sometimes from certain like advertisements from the 30s, a couple of vintage French perfume advertisements, that there was a lot of illustration already, and coming to represent something closely to sort of the original is one step forward. But I think that in exploring what it means to paint for me, I didn't know that I really enjoyed this tiny
Pushing paint.
the representational, especially on the small scale, that there's the only real representational pieces in these works are pretty small. Knowing that, I don't know, I think it's just a matter of my exploring. I don't know if I could have expressed some of these concepts with perfect representation. And I wasn't trying to be abstract, and nor was I specifically trying to reference certain art historical styles of painting.
Sure.
I recognize that they do, because I'm aware of what they are and how they look in the world and what other people are doing with them. But I feel like this work is very varied in style, mostly because I was just exploring the ways in which I could paint. Yeah. And at times just really enjoying the thick. I mean, I also was originally an acrylic painter. I was taught in high school, and they gave you acrylic paint. So it was only more recently that I still don't know how to use oil paints perfectly. So the exploration was a lot of the pleasure of pushing that buttery paint around, and color. Yeah. Everyone that knows my work knows how much I love color, and so seeing what I could do was that was probably the most creative I was. I wasn't thinking I'm going to mix styles. It just made sense piece by piece. This does, for example, there's a painting of a bouquet, and on the inside, the painting is actually a reference of an ad, and where the perfume bottle was, I've instead created a hole within which we see another space. And I knew that the colored area I wanted to put in there was going to seem to reference flowers, because it's a bouquet. And I knew then that, of course, I didn't want to be too representational, because I didn't want it to be just, here's a part of color bouquet, and then the bouquet falls into a tonal range. But so in those ways, a lot of what I was trying to do and how I wanted it to read determined how it was going to be represented. And then in that one, the third layer is 3 glasses that came from a website with very good, very expensive housewares, but very well photographed and very styled, the photographs. So to me, those felt like a very refreshing and different sort of advertisement, because they were very appealing, and their appealing was part of the sales pitch. And so for those, getting closer to representation was so fun. But there was a part of, as paint allows you, I think, even more than photography, there was a point at which I was, instead of adding the shadow and darks, I thought it was so beautiful. The sort of undertone of the overall painting was more beautiful. So I was able to sort of play with the negative spaces, not as shadow, but as something more. So there's just, paint gives you such latitude.
Yeah, and I know we've discussed too, and other people who have walked into this space have brought it up, because you're not taking hard edge photographs and sticking to a specific style, and you're really giving yourself space. By giving yourself space, I think you give the viewer a lot of space to explore too.
I think people are it's been fascinating seeing at the opening how people responded to them, because it was much because I think of exactly what you're saying, it was much more broad than usually my work is pretty explicit, even if there's a lot of room for interpretation, then the range is more narrow.
Yeah.
And or it's directed and it seems specific enough that you feel as though there is a correct viewing. And with these, yeah, that room does give them not only that, but the representation and letting that fall apart. Like there's a lot of room that I hope isn't too much for people, and maybe for some it is, and that's fine. But I felt like people were really engaging with that, which I was, of course, so pleased.
Yeah, I mean, to be able to stand in front of any of these canvases and to talk with somebody about what they see, it's always a completely different conversation.
Yes.
And you brought up referencing 1930s perfume advertising. What drew you to specific ads as you were putting this exhibition together, and why pull from so far from the past? Were you referencing anything contemporary?
A little bit. I mean, the website, but mostly I keep folders of images that when I run across them and they really strike me, I keep them in a sort of inspiration folder, and I have different ones for painting and different ones for just things that just rivet me in a way. And I'll often go back and look at images like that. And because I've worked in referencing ads for so long, and I have specifically with beauty products for women, I have folders on perfume and lipstick, and there are some specific pictures that I really lean heavily on that in terms of that just captivate me in a way that usually that could be, they can almost make the hair stand on my neck when I think of it, because advertising can really be alienating in a way that I find appealing. When they carry the imaginary body a little far, it can, even in the 30s, this sort of, there's just specific images, and at times it was color choices. There are a few of these paintings. These two both reference the same ad, and you can see that there's a similar color palettes, and especially the bottom, these warm colors that I found so beautiful and so well done. And there was a way in which I felt that using an existing color scheme was a way in to guarantee a beauty and a perfection that I could then use as a place to decide what I wanted to do with it. So I think it's partly the way my mind works, but also oftentimes they just are something that had, and some of the ads have this sort of perfume bottle that is a very, lots of greens in this way that is somewhat unappealing, and that in as well, I think is partly what kept me going back to that advertisement specifically. But in terms of, sometimes I was just in the process of deciding what I was going to do in a painting. I would be grabbing pieces of the color, dropping them in to just say, if it's this theme and this kind of colors, and then especially with the first one, which I was lucky to have come about, I suddenly looked at it and I decided to paint what I saw instead of where I was going to go with it, because it was so the haphazard way. I mean, I've often in photography, some of my favorite work is work that I was but I was really trying to push representation on in terms of framing, because I can be very formal with framing, very straight on, very composed, and yet so some of my favorite photography is in which it's almost accidental, and so that the accident, the way that came about, was so compelling to me, and that's where the edges came from, is that I was really just putting pieces down to see, but the pieces made sense because I have we're put together in pieces. We are pieces.
Yeah.
We're pieces that we didn't ask for. We're pieces that we wish we could force in. That's how we understand who we are.
It almost goes against some of the things that we've been talking about before, but I think it's surprising how actually representational some of your paintings are. You wouldn't know that.
Yes.
But this painting on the left, I mean, I saw the digital composition that you put together to be able to paint this, and it is so true to that digital. Like you are. Yes. These are weirdly representational paintings.
That's true. That's true. Especially that one. It was insane the level to which when I liked something, I was getting in and I was painting it as if I was painting pieces of a puzzle. I am not kidding. And at some point I thought I need to stop doing that, but that's why I started getting into trouble, because I was then creating with a sort of sense of emotion, and at times that was working, and I allow myself that because I think at times it was successful. But there were times in which it was taking away what I loved about the concept and the way I felt it would be read. So, I mean, I think that
you've held on to it. You've held it. Because I think that, well, I should ask, what do you want people to feel when they're looking at this work?
I want them to, I ideally would like them to understand that in the same way that life is not what we expected it to be a few years ago, much less from our youth. You know, life just simply is never what you anticipate being an adult's going to be like, but that's been exaggerated in this world. And I want that sense of hopefulness you were describing earlier. To me, that's very important because I do believe that despite the conversation that constantly relies on the anxieties, that capability is my focus, you know, that we are capable. And it's just such a shame to me that there's so much fear waged. And I think that's in some way interesting in that I work in advertising, which is a place where anxieties cannot exist, where it is only the veiled perfection. But I mean, my project over all these years is to do what I could do to bring in a real life to a space that can't accommodate it and say, you can accommodate this. And I think in that same way, I think my message to viewers is we can accommodate both all senses and sensations, but with our capabilities intact, if that makes sense.
It does make sense.
I mean, that's a sort of overview. Not that I feel like each piece says that, but.
Sure, and I think that in so many ways, we're experiencing that together right now.
Yes.
That like desire for, what if we could step back from the anxiety? What would that look like? What would be possible for us?
Yes.
And that sense of hope that, you know, we've talked about a few times today, is present in all these pieces, not explicitly and in different degrees and different paintings.
Yes.
But it's there throughout.
Yes, and I feel like that's an honest way to go forward as humans, is to push less of that anxiety. Well, I can't say push it away because there's so much of people are overwhelmed, and I understand that. But that the degree to which we can incorporate those anxieties and yet remain flexible and buoyant, like that is being flexible, which I'm not always at all, and it's a constant battle to deal with those impediments to thought and action, but it's that approach to me is critical to remember because it's what we can do in the face of it, because that's then projected out into like as a person in a mortal body. Like all we can do is understand the extent to which the existential terrors are covered and present in every day, and yet do something to try to create some amount of elegance in the face of that knowingness. To me, it's important to take that medicine and then to also then do what one can with that in one's system. So that sounds really prescriptive, and maybe it is.
Maybe it is. But your work doesn't feel prescriptive, and I do think that art is such a wonderful place for people to be able to like come to these conclusions at their own pace.
Absolutely. And maybe not at all, especially.
Yeah. So I think that your work is not answering specific questions. It's beautifully open to the viewer to interpret it, you know, however they want to. You're giving us a lot to play with, and yet at the same time, I think that everybody can't help but walk away from looking at your paintings and have an experience of beauty first, quality first, and like there is, as much as there's little moments of what's happening here, questions, there's like a sense of ease too to your work. You've done a really wonderful job of balancing all these really complicated emotions, and I'm just appreciative of you putting this show together.
Thanks. And you as well, putting it together equally.
Yeah. It was a fun year to work together. Is there anything else about the show that you hope folks who come in will think and that you want to mention?
Not that I can think of. I mean, I really do hope that a lot of the more difficult elements that I've stated are really not at the forefront of their mind, because that's just my lens, and that's my way I experience life. And so, I think that commitment to beauty first was important, and I guess I don't offer these works as a respite, but I think that they hopefully have that.
Yeah, I think we've accomplished that, absolutely.
Okay, good.
I think so.
Okay.
So this exhibition is on view until April 5th. So we just opened Saturday night, about 5 weeks until the show closes. I hope that you will be able to come in. And thank you so much for your time this morning to talk with me about the show. It's a beautiful show. Congrats.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.